I had a school friend who lived in Lutyens House, and I can remember standing on the balcony outside his front door, looking down at a terrace of houses opposite that were being demolished. And I remember his brother saying he wasn't sure why they were being demolished because people still lived there. And I thought it was pretty obvious why they were knocking down, because they looked really old and dilapidated and kind of clapped out compared with all these modern blocks that we now lived in with hot and cold running water and central heating. It was the idea of something modern and new and clean. I think when you look back at films of people who occupied new council housing, 40s, 50s, even 60s, what you see is people who are very, very happy with what they've got. And the reason for that is, which we all forget now, is what they came from. And by and large, fortunately for most people, they don't have to experience the conditions, certainly, that their grandparents did, where what we would now regard as basic and essential facilities were simply not available.
The late 1940s was a radical time, when Britain first turned old ideas of a national health service and a full welfare state into reality. It was an era that deliberately and unashamedly promised a brave new world for everyone. This is Churchill Gardens today. What's clear is that it's totally different to everything around it. If this is as far as the housing revolution got, what happened to the rest of Abercrombie's plan? The only way to find out is from the air. Archaeologist Chris Going has been documenting the changing face of London from the air for the last 5 years.
We have 9 frames on the second run, I think.
By flying exactly the same route the RAF did 60 years ago to create the first aerial surveys, Chris hopes to create an identical modern survey of his own.
What we're doing today is we're producing imagery which, when we compare with the 1945 material, gives you in one go, if you like, all the changes we've seen in the city of London, in the centre of London, in the last 60 years. So it's effectively a time machine.
By lining up the 2 complete sets of images, Chris is able to switch between the past and the present. Between the London Abercrombie was about to change and what we actually ended up with. And overall, there appears to be very little difference. The basic matrix of roads is largely unaltered. There's certainly no sign of any great unified vision.
If the population of London of the later 40s or the 50s could look at the London of 2008, of the 21st century, I think the thing that they would most clearly say is how incoherent it looks. It does not look like the sort of envisaged city of the planners of the 40s and 50s.
When it came to housing, local authorities never followed the Churchill Gardens model, but took to building clusters of high-rise tower blocks instead. While around them, private housing remained almost entirely pre-war vintage. Exactly the opposite of Abercrombie's vision. The plan to double the total area of green space in the city produced just one notable South London park. And the transport revolution that promised fast access along multi-lane freeways throughout the centre of the city never reached that far. Today, congestion blights the motorways running into London, because the centre is just the same old maze of streets from before the war. And in the heart of the city, where a great modernist capital was meant to stretch along the Thames, only the centrepiece, the Royal Festival Hall, was ever built. Ultimately, Abercrombie failed. But his failure should be judged in the light of history, because London had tried this kind of thing before. 300 years earlier, after the Great Fire, Christopher Wren came up with a grand new vision for London. A formal European capital that would radiate out from the glorious centrepiece of St. Paul's Cathedral. But just as with Abercrombie, the centrepiece was all that got built. Neither man managed to get the money or the political backing to tear down the city and start again.
Wren had a big vision for London, which he was not able to fulfil because of the competing interests of people who basically just wanted to get back to what it was like before. After the Second World War, Abercrombie had a plan, but London is resistant to grand plans.
Yet London has been transformed all the same. From the city of the 1940s to the city of today, there's a world of difference. And far from following any central plan, it's largely the result of barely controlled economic forces.
What London responds to is trade, commerce, money, markets, prosperity and movement. And in the end, what has made London is precisely those things.
Money changed London in ways no one in the 1940s could ever have imagined. Because London changed the way it made money. And nowhere shows this more clearly than here. The modern geometric blocks of Canary Wharf now hide what used to power this city, the docks. Since Roman times, London's docks have been the engine room of the city's economy. Stretching for 10 miles along the Thames, by the late 1930s, the Port of London had grown to be the largest in the world. This was where the whole of the British Empire brought its goods to trade. Which is why, when the war ended, the docks were rebuilt immediately. Dock workers had to make do with living in prefabs. And for 30 years after the war, life in the docks went on more or less as it had before and looked set to continue unchanged forever. What they didn't see coming was this. By the 1970s, what the world's economy demanded for shipping was giant bulk containers carried on giant container ships that could only be processed in giant container ports, like Felixstowe. None of which would fit into London's tight, narrow river with its densely packed, labour-intensive docks. As the last dock facilities finally closed at the end of the 70s, the remaining 10,000 jobs went with them, leaving behind a vast, derelict wasteland.
When the docks became redundant in the early 1970s, there was a great think about what to do with this area. There was a public sector body set up which was going nowhere, and then suddenly the hand of commerce intervened because people who were having a problem getting sufficient office space in the City of London at the sort of rents they thought they should be paying, suddenly looked at Canary Wharf and thought, why don't we do it down there? And this great private sector experiment began.
This was the first time in hundreds of years that 8 square miles of prime building land had appeared so close to the centre of London.
There was an unrivaled opportunity to think through what the whole development would be over its entire lifespan and to plan for that right from day one. This was very unusual.